other people around you. So last year was a bit of a crazy year for me. I invited the entire world into my life through Marie Claire magazine, and that article and my It Gets Better video basically told hundreds of thousands of people that I'm trans. And still in this day and age, even though trans people have been here forever, it's still a revolutionary, crazy, freak show of a thing for a lot of people. And telling my story changed my life. My life didn't start with the act of storytelling, so I want to back up a little bit and tell you a story about one of my first defiant acts. I took my first steps in Honolulu, Hawaii. I was the firstborn son of my parents. They named me after my dad. They dressed me in baseball team onesies and baby tracksuits. And, like most people, my gender was translated for me at the start. But I'd say about the age of 4 or 5, I turned out quite differently than the son my parents expected me to be. I walked around with the playground with, limp wrist. I had a sort of wiggle in my hips. I'd play jacks and jump rope with kids my age for hours. And this was a complete contrast. I'm one of 5, but my brother Chad, who's a year younger than me, he was completely different. He'd come home with scraped knees and bruises from playing football with the boys, who I had no interest in playing with. I was very all about the binary when I was young, which I've grown out of. And one of the stories my siblings love to tease me about involves me wearing a Hawaiian muumuu, one of those big, flowery, really kind of ugly dresses that older women tend to wear in the islands. I snatched the dress off of the clothing line and put it on my body because my friend dared me to. And I just remember the thrill of putting it on me because for the first time in my life, it was the first time that I presented as female, as the girl that I felt myself to be. And, I just remember just feeling amazingly happy because I was just being me. I was just being a kid expressing myself. And then my grandmother spotted me and she yelled at me and she smacked me right across my butt. The story, when my sisters tell it at Thanksgiving, they love to tease me about it. Like, oh, you remember the time Grandma caught you in that dress? We all laugh, and it was funny, but at the time it wasn't funny to me because I was just 6 years old. And it was the first time that I knew the me that I felt myself to be wasn't right. Who I thought I was told I was wrong. And in effect, I learned that I was wrong. And I'd go on to have a series of these battles with my parents growing up. We'd have arguments about the length of my hair, the tight fit of my jeans, my penchant for writing in my journals for hours upon end. To my father, I probably was the most navel-gazing femme son any dad who just wanted a football player could have asked for. And I was acutely aware of the fact that I was different. And it took me probably until the 7th grade. For a lot of people, they're like, oh, that's so young, but for me, it's been a long time. So the 7th grade where I realized that, I started owning being different. And, I look at you all here and I think of the same thing. I see how young you are. And someone was just interviewing me for a newspaper and he said he was a sophomore in college. And I was like, oh, I remember when I was that. And I was like, that's not a long time ago. And, I met my friend Wendy in the 7th grade. And she was this flamboyant queen. And if she was up here to tell the story, she would say she was more of a goddess than a queen. She really would. But this is my version of our story. Wendy had green hair, short in a little bob. She wore short shorts with knee-high socks. And she walked around our school as if she owned it, like just owned it. And her fearlessness to be fully herself as a trans girl was just amazing to me. It was amazingly powerful because I saw myself reflected in someone my age, someone who was just kind of being. And it shook me inside. It shook me to the point of recognition, just recognizing myself, who I was at the age of 12. And her friendship is the foundation into which I stand here today. And I always talk about this stuff because we can't do any of these things alone. She was the first person to tweeze my eyebrows really badly. She was, I had eyebrows up here. It's like in my It Gets Better video, you can see it. She was making anyone else who loved me happy because I knew that that would be the biggest gift that I would give to myself, was choosing me, choosing to love me and not denying who I was. And because of that, I went on to transition through the halls of my high school as a freshman. And looking back at this time, I marvel at 2 things. I marvel at my unwavering sense of self and my youth. At 15, I seriously, and no one could debate with me ever, I thought that Justin Timberlake wearing cornrows made him a cutting-edge artist. And though I was wrong about a lot of things, I made a lot of mistakes along the way, no one could make me question who I was. And I believe that that sense of self-assuredness, which I can see in all of you here, is the key, or was the key to my success in high school. You know, I was captain of the volleyball team. I played tuba in the marching band. I was vice president of my class. And I even graduated with our school's only academic scholarship to college. You know, no matter how dedicated I was to ensuring that the world saw me as a girl, I was also equally as committed to ensuring that I had a life worth living after transitioning, and that that went way beyond just being fierce. I wanted to be more than pretty. I wanted to be successful. And I think that a lot of young women, they tend to miss that, just young women, period. And so after high school, I earned my bachelor's from the University of Hawaii, and I went to NYU to attend journalism school. And when I moved to New York, I chose not to lead with the fact that I was trans. And it was liberating. It was the first time in my life that I could just be another girl in the crowd. No one was whispering about me. No one was calling me the wrong pronouns to put me in my place. No one knew where I'd been. And I was free to be me for the first time in my entire life. And with that privilege, that advantage that most people whose gender identity matches their assigned sex take for granted, I was able to learn about storytelling from the best journalists in the world. I got internships at InStyle and Playboy and Women's Wear Daily magazines, and I ended up landing my dream job as an online editor for People magazine. You know, I was living my Carrie Bradshaw-inspired fantasy, or so I thought. And you know, after a while, I worked at People for almost 6 years, and as I was basking in my success, you know, I was a young, you know, woman of color, going to bars and hanging out with guys and, you know, just having fun and just being myself. But as I was basking in my success, I was acutely aware of the fact that other girls like myself who weren't warranted the same opportunities were grappling with not having a home or health care. They were victims of abuse, and they also were unable to support themselves without turning to the streets. There were girls like Paige Clay and Brandy Martell who were murdered because of the fact that they challenged society's portrait of womanhood. And then there were women like Lorena Escalera, whose body was gawked at by the New York Times after her tragic death. And of course, Cece McDonald, who fought back against racist and transphobic brutality and ended up in jail for defending herself. I noticed all of these injustices and other moments of cis-sexism and so much more. And to be honest, at the time, I didn't feel like doing anything about it because I felt as if I had done enough and gone through enough in my own life and my own personal journey that I didn't need to take on anyone else's drama. And I was also, if I was going to be honest, I was also afraid of what people would say about me if I said I was trans. Because why would anyone want to attach themselves to a group of people who are told that they're confused, and who are told that they're sick, and who are told that they can't use this restroom, and they can't live here, and they can't work there, and who in 34 states can still be legally fired for being exactly who they are. And like many young women of color, young trans women, my sisters, are being hunted down to no media attention to that at all, beyond our own whispers and cries in our own community. Why would anyone want to attach themselves to a community like that, I thought at the time. And as I list these systematic injustices, I also face myself. And my internalized shame, and my inherent fears about who I was. Before sharing my story, I grappled with issues of self-worth and walked around thinking that my so-called transness limited me. I had placed a shade above my own head that I walked around with for years, and I hid behind the shade because I felt less than. And I felt that maybe my voice was not worth hearing because there was no one like me talking about issues that mattered to me. And what I came to realize is that just because we don't see the images and stories that reflect us and our community does not mean that our voices are not worth hearing. We have to accept our luminescence and our light. And we cannot let anyone tell us that because of who we are, because of being different, that it takes away from our brightness. It adds to it. And so I made the choice to contribute my voice. I spoke up last year because I needed to show the world that girls like us were capable of so much more. We're capable of so much more of living a life in the dark, or being some man's sex object or his punching bag. We were not survivors. We were not victims, I'm sorry. We were survivors. And I decided to live visibly because being silent for me would only enable me to express just a fraction of who I was. And I was frankly tired of dimming my light. I spoke up because that's what generations of our people have done. And I can't help but follow in the example of my fairy godmothers, my sheroes, Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson. Actually, who in here has heard of Sylvia Rivera? That's nice. What about Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson? Well, for those who have not heard of them, be prepared because you will learn it, and you will learn it well. Marsha and Sylvia were two girls from the streets of New York. Sylvia was a Latina queen who hustled, and while hustling in Times Square, she met Marsha, who was a black queen, who wore flowers in her hair and always had a big smile. They would become lifelong friends and sisters and fellow woman warriors. These two women were at the outbreak of Stonewall riots. They fought back against the police, and they fought back to be openly who they are. We take that for granted sometimes, but they helped ignite the gay and lesbian liberation movement, which we've all benefited from. These two women raised their voices and pounded the pavement in their heels to fight for their community. They yelled and they roared and they refused to be silenced by anyone. And not even their brothers and sisters who actually tried to exclude them from the movement because they were not mainstream enough. Very early on, actually, at the Christopher Street Liberation Rally in 1973 in New York City, Sylvia, there's footage of her getting beat up and being pushed off stage. And in some miraculous way, she fights her way back on stage, grabs the mic, and screams, "Y'all better quiet down." And it's a line that I will never forget, but I think I won't forget it because she's screaming at her community, right? The community that she's fought for, the community that she's fought on the front lines for, the community she's been arrested for. And she yells at them for caring only about middle-class white folks and their issues, not the street kids, not the kids of color, not the drag queens. They don't want anything to do with that. And she rages against them because they want her out. And they want her out because she's loud, and she's Latina, and she's from the streets, and she's engaged in sex work, and all of these things, but she was a leader. And no one could dim her light. And she finds the strength within herself to control her rage and still express love, even though she's yelling and screaming. I don't know if anyone's seen this footage, but it's remarkable. And it's a lesson to me, and I think it's a lesson to all of us. We must continue to shine our light despite anyone's attempts to throw shade our way. And no one could dim their light, Sylvia and Marsha. They broke the mold and they made a difference. You know, these two women from the streets of New York, they actually rallied their money together, and they would hustle on the weekends, bring their money together and rent an apartment on the Lower East Side of New York, where they brought in, trans and queer youth who stayed with them, who had no other home, and they called it Star House, which is Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries. And they had this little home that was just their little own, and they pay the rent, and they scrounge up some food, like at the corner deli, and get some eggs for their people, and they would take care of their own. And I think that, and I think about what Corey and Quincy have created here, with the board of HBGC. What they've created here is that they created a space where they're taking care of their own, right? And I think about what Michelle Obama said. They could have easily shut the door behind them after quote unquote making it. But instead, as she said at her DNC speech this year, she said, when you walk through that doorway of opportunity, you don't slam the door shut behind you. You reach back and you give others the same chances that helped you succeed. You reach back and you pull your people up with you. And I believe one of the most revolutionary things we can do as a community is empower those around us to live openly and visibly and authentically. And this is why we remain committed to the power of storytelling to ignite change. Not so much in other people, but amongst ourselves. And that's why I encourage you to tell your stories, to live authentically, to act from your truth, and then also to pull your people up with you as you rise. And so my hope for you on this day is that you are able to live your most authentic lives, and that you allow others to see you just as you are right here, without shame or fear of what anyone may say about you. And I hope that you can be kind to others, and that you speak up against the injustices that you notice, and you not turn a blind eye. And probably most importantly, I hope that you can be kind to yourselves, and you allow love and abundance into your lives. Because a true sense of acceptance gives you access to authentic power. Thank you.